Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to our webinar on supporting our Muslim students. We have a special guest speaker today, and she will focus on how we can support our students as they return to school and having dealt with the pandemic and all the other things that our children are faced with during their daily lives. I'm going to begin by introducing Dr. Susie Ismail, who is the founder of Cornerstone, an organization that supports community, family, and youth and counseling. She has been an integral part of our community for years and has been at the forefront of trying to change the mindset about how we perceive mental health. She's an author, a speaker, and a counselor and an educator. So we welcome Dr. Susie Ismail and hope that she can help us find our way through this next year, insha'Allah. Dr. Susie.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Layla, for inviting me and for having me be a part of this program. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It is an honor to be spending a little bit of time this Saturday afternoon with you all. One of the best things about educators I always find is that even when we're not required to be in the classroom, we will still seek out opportunities to learn and to improve ourselves for the sake of, insha'Allah, hopefully being able to better impact our students and those that are an amana entrusted to us throughout the school year. So supporting our Muslim students, that's the topic for today. And that's how we're going to try to really better gauge, what happens when we return to our classrooms? What are we seeing? What have we been witnessing over the past year and a half from a spiritual, psycho-socio emotional perspective? And how have our students been responding and reacting to it? And particularly, how can we utilize the Islamic components and the elements of our Islamic faith that guide us through really holistic wellness? How can we utilize that in the classroom, in our teaching techniques, in the way that we reach our students, regardless if it's in the math classroom, in the English classroom, in the guidance counselor's office, in the administrator's office, but how can we really connect with our students to help them in this coming year after a year and a half of very drastic changes and different experiences? So our focus at Cornerstone and what we try to do in the work that we do with families and with youth and with children and people of all ages is really to bring together the holistic elements, not to look at wellness in a silo, just in terms of mental health or just in terms of spiritual perspective, but really recognizing the marriage between all of those elements in terms of spiritual, psycho-socio-emotional wellness. And all of these components come together holistically to really impact the way that we see our world, the way that we react to it, the way we respond to it, and our worldviews. And we see the struggles quite often in the younger generation among youth when any of these components has been thrown off. When there is a difficulty in the spiritual realm, we see it impacting the psychological realm. When there's difficulty in the social realm, we see it impacting the emotional realm. And so it really all comes together. And this is the focus that we as educators can also take when we're in our classrooms and when we're interacting with our students and when we're guiding our teachers, if we're administrators, in terms of interacting with our students, taking more of a holistic approach. So the holistic approach really looks at these different components. We know that the spiritual, from a faith-based perspective, is integral in really refocusing hope and purpose. Just a few months ago, I believe it was right before Ramadan, many of us were, very much affected and traumatized in many ways by the story that came out of the situation in Texas of the two brothers who had taken their own lives, but prior to doing so, they took the lives of all their family members as well. And there was a letter that was written, and in the letter that was written, these young boys, teenagers, or young adults, I guess, who had been brought up in a Muslim home, who had been going to the masjid, in their entire lives. One of the statements that was made was that there was no purpose to life, and that really, if being alive meant being happy, if you weren't happy, then you shouldn't be alive anymore. And this is a narrative that we're hearing more and more among young people. And a lot of times we think like, oh, not us, not in our Muslim communities. We have purpose in our life. We know that the purpose is to please Allah Azza wa Jal. But the reality is that sometimes the connection is not made for our young people of how do you live this purpose day in and day out, and how does this purpose bring hope into your life? And so this is a critical element in rebuilding the psycho-socio emotional wellness of our students, bringing back that aspect of hope and tying it back to the spiritual concepts of what is our purpose. And we know our purpose in this dunya is not necessarily to be happy, right? We find happiness and joy in terms of contentment in seeking rida, but we find that contentment and that rida in being pleased with the will of Allah. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can bring in those concepts when dealing with some of the mental health struggles that many of our students may deal with. And how do we make sure that we're not either oring, we're not either taking a secular approach to dealing with or helping our students deal with the difficult mental and emotional struggles they may have, and we're not either just or taking a religious approach, but being able to marry the two together. And just as a side note for everyone who is attending, I do have my chat box open. I know I tend to have the Northeast fast way of speaking, so sometimes I can speak quickly. I have the chat box open. If you guys need me to repeat anything, if there's anything I say that you want to bring in a comment or a point to, I love interactive sessions, and I'm still trying to figure out how to be very interactive with Zoom, but all I've found so far is the chat box. So please, as I'm speaking, if there's something that you want me to clarify, if you have an anecdote or something you want to share, just drop it in the chat box, and then we can always turn back to the voice recording as well, or the mic, so that you can speak or you can type it. And it makes me feel like I'm not just talking to myself. So feel free to put things in the chat box. Even emojis are very welcome. Okay. So the spiritual, the emotional, as we know, it has to do with finding those healthy outlets, and recognizing that emotions are valid. Because for many of our young people, one of the struggles that they have at home is a feeling of being invalidated. That, if they were to tell their parents, I feel sad, the response is like, well, you don't pray enough. Of course you're going to be sad, right? Or if the feeling is, I'm actually feeling depressed. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that terminology may be a little bit problematic when it's overused. But if a child says, I feel depressed, and a parent dismisses it and says, what are you talking about? You have a roof over your head. I just bought you the PlayStation. What more could you want? There's an invalidation there, and that can cause difficulty in terms of emotional growth and in being able to find a healthy outlet for speaking about emotions. The relational, of course, the impact of family members, friends, classmates, teachers, that all ties into how a student kind of is able to view themselves and view the world around them. The physical and the nutritional, we don't want to limit the impact of that, because it is impactful. And, one of the things that we've been hearing a lot about, throughout the pandemic is quarantine weight gain. And a lot of young people in particular who may struggle with body image, with eating disorders, have really been bringing this to the forefront, that the inability to be out and about, the limited activity, the food choices that are being made, and that's been impacting wellness as well. And of course, the very real impact and the implications of mental health and mental wellness. And we do like to approach, the mental component here as mental wellness rather than mental illness, because all of us are on a journey towards seeking and achieving mental wellness. But when we start stigmatizing it as mental illness, that's immediately, it sets up a bit of a barrier, and we shy away from the idea that it's an illness. And so when talking to our students even about mental well-being, we want to use those positive terms, speaking about it as mental wellness, as mental health, and utilizing positive terms that bring them closer to better understanding that our mental struggles is something that all of us go through at different points in our lives, and that it's something healthy to address. All right, so what are some of our concerns post-pandemic, returning to schools? And this is where I would love to hear from the attendees. I'd love to hear if you want to put it in the chat box, if you want to use your mic, that's fine. But what do you feel educators are facing? What do you think our kids are facing? What are ways that we can help ourselves and ways that we can help our students? So let's tackle the first two questions together first. If you can put in the drop box or in the chat box, what you think the biggest problems that we may see upon returning to school in person, face-to-face, post-pandemic. And I know some of you have had hybrid classes already. Some of you have, continued online throughout the past year and a half. But I do believe, as Dr. Aqsa was saying, we're all returning face-to-face in some form. So just drop it in the chat box if you don't mind, what you think educators are facing and what do you think our children are facing post-pandemic. All right. I don't see anyone typing, but I'm not sure. So yeah, go ahead. If somebody wants to say something, yeah, go ahead, brother.
Assalamu alaikum. I think just the whole dynamic of after that whole almost 2 years, 1.5 years, what is it going to be like? Because everybody is watching or is on social media looking at Facebook and they see families out and about, and majority of these children 12 and under have not been vaccinated. So I think it's not an academic concern, but it's more a real perspective of what happens if somebody does get the COVID and then it spreads in the classroom or even a school, and that's like a high priority even before you get into that classroom. So I think that's something that teachers and educators are facing, and schools in general. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Jazakallah khair. Yeah, Dr. Aqsa? I think you're still muted though.
No, I agree with Brother Farad about that. And I'm also concerned about students, children who had been in out of school for so long, and coming back to school with, and alhamdulillah, there are some schools who had in-person even towards the end of the school year last year, but still coming in with the full strength and being able to now learn to interact with the skill to interact, especially for those students who are in first grade right now, had actually missed the opportunity to be in the kindergarten classroom and be able to learn those skills that are really needed during the classroom. So they're coming in with that gap in that first grade, and I'm wondering, how we're going to manage, how the schools and the leaders would be able to work with the teachers and be able to provide some strategies to catch up with those skills, inshallah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Panel, those are two really good concerns that you're bringing to the forefront. And I think to answer our brother Fawad's concerns first, the uncertainty is very real. And what we've been seeing throughout the pandemic is a rise in what we consider uncertainty avoidance. Normally here in the US, we tend to naturally have a higher uncertainty avoidance, meaning we like to plan, we like to know what's happening next, we like to know where we're going and what we're doing and what's going to happen after this. And children, generally speaking, have a lower uncertainty avoidance, right? They tend to be a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty, but we've been seeing an increase in children's levels of uncertainty avoidance, and the fears that tie into that. A lot of times you'll just get that catch-all label of, oh, it's anxiety, or, I'm feeling anxious. But high uncertainty avoidance can definitely lead to those emotions. And as teachers, administrators, as parents, as the students themselves, the not knowing can definitely lead to a lot of question marks and a lot of feelings of uncertainty that can increase what may be, if it's diagnosed. There can be situational and there can be chronic, diagnosed as anxiety. So we're definitely seeing a lot more of that. And one of the things that, when we talk about how do we help in that corner, giving our students small spheres of control. So one of the best remedies for decreasing uncertainty avoidance is to give small spheres of control. And, we use the example of like, if a child tells the parent, like, I want to go to my friend's house. Can I go to my friend's house? If the parent's response is insha'Allah, right? The child kind of feels right away like, okay, that's either no or never, right? There's no, even though the insha'Allah means like, okay, like we'll address it when the time comes, but there is a lack of certainty there. And so being able to provide our students with spheres of control, meaning allowing them to understand and recognize what is within their control. They may not be able to control whether or not, of course, none of us can control whether or not somebody gets affected by the virus or somebody winds up, bringing the virus into the school and the school gets shut down. That's outside of our control. But what we can control is how we're going to respond to it. So are we going to respond to it with alhamdulillah? Are we going to respond to it by saying, you know what, we've got a strategy in place. And maybe from the first day, really giving our students that sense of comfort, letting them know, you know what, students, it's hard. We've all been gone from the typical school day for so long, but here's the plan. If things happen and we do have to shut down again, our intention is to do ABC. And of course, it depends on the grade level of the children. It depends on, how you're approaching it, but giving them some sense of certainty, knowing that there is a backup plan, knowing that, things will move in this direction, almost like if-then statements. If this happens, then insha'Allah, this is how we plan on handling it. And that's been shown to decrease the level of uncertainty avoidance among children. In terms of what Dr. Azra was saying, and I apologize, I think I was calling you Aqsa before. So in terms of what Dr. Azra was saying, in terms of the academic gap, and I think that's one thing that we've all kind of struggled with a little bit. Where are the students? We don't know who was doing the online homework and who wasn't, who was struggling, who wasn't getting concepts. And we're going to talk a little bit about nonverbal cues and getting a bit better at reading our students' nonverbal cues to be able to pick up on when our students may be at a loss, when they may be struggling a bit. You mentioned, kindergarten and first grade. I mean, absolutely, there is something that was lost in maybe that socialization, but there were also a lot of skills that were learned. And our first graders are probably better equipped with, online navigation and Zoom classrooms than any first graders were in the history of first grade. So I think being able to play up the strengths, being able to remind our students that they may not have gotten, the Lego time, in circles with their classmates, but they did get to play online games. And that's something that's valuable as well. And as teachers and as administrators, as we speak to our teachers and guide them through it, reminding them that some skills may be, at a deficit. They may be lacking a little bit, but think about the other skills that were gained and kind of playing up those highlights. That's going to help also in terms of positivity and the way that we view where our students are at. There's a question here that says some students, or a comment, it says some students worry about interacting with their classmates and teachers in person after they've stayed home for a long time. Absolutely, socialization is going to be one of what we believe is the biggest hurdles in re-entry, because a year and a half of social distancing, and now we're essentially undistancing. And we're coming from different viewpoints. You're going to find some students whose parents didn't let them out of the house at all. And you're going to find some students whose parents may have been like, it's cool, go out. There's no problem with it. So we are going to see those differences as well. And it's going to take some navigating. And we're going to talk together in today's session, inshallah, particularly about nonverbals and how we can utilize nonverbal cues to help our students, even in terms of the resocialization and the undistancing, essentially. All right, so this chart that we have up here, it's normally the chart that we utilize when we speak to refugees and resettlement agencies about integration and what happens when somebody leaves a country and enters into a new country. And what we're finding is this U-curve of culture shock may be indicative of what we may see among our students in school as well upon returning to school. That there is this sense initially, we may see a lot of excitement, that honeymoon period where the kids are excited, yay, like I miss school, I miss my teachers, right? And there's a bit of excitement, even though the masks are on, even though there will probably be distancing, there's going to be changes in terms of the physical space as well as the interactions, but that honeymoon period is likely to occur at the start. Then we anticipate the reality begins to settle in, and there may be frustration as students begin to realize, I'm so far behind, as teachers begin to feel maybe a sense of like, it's so hard to go from the online world to the on-site. So we are expecting that frustration. Usually as the frustration kind of increases, we tend to see a decline in terms of the adjustment. And there's difficulty in adjustment, but then after we hit the lowest point, we'll start to see recovery. And following that recovery, we see balance in which there's adaptation. And, subhanAllah, it's so interesting because we see this among, many of the refugee clients that we work with as they go through that U curve of the shock kind of adjusting. And I want us, as teachers and administrators, as educators, to anticipate that we may be seeing this U curve in our classrooms as well. But to realize that, alhamdulillah, adaptation, I want to say, almost 99% of the time does occur, and it does occur successfully. So bi'idhnillah, our children will also reach that place of adaptation because it's about building emotional resilience. And as we learn for ourselves how to become more emotionally resilient, we'll be able to teach our students as well how to emulate that emotional resilience. I'm also seeing someone who said here that some students may have lost family members or friends due to COVID-19. And how do you deal with that? And how do you bring comfort and peace to them? That's a wonderful question. And we're going to talk about loss and dealing with loss in a minute. So I'm going to hold off on that one until we get to that slide, insha'Allah. All right, so right along those lines, though, with the impact of the social distancing, the impact of loss and the experience of loss, whether it's loved ones, family members, or for many children, we're going to see parents who have lost their jobs, maybe, who have lost that sense of socialization. And so their mental health has been affected. And so in turn, it's affected the family dynamics and the children as well. So we're going to see some mental health issues arising. And as we said, mental wellness is the way that we want to frame it, that we're all seeking more of a mental wellness perspective rather than mental illness. So the fact is that 1 in 5 children between the ages of 13 to 18 have or will have a serious mental illness. And when we look at the statistic, we see 20% of youth between the ages of 13 to 18 live with a mental health condition. 11% have a mood disorder, 10% have a behavior or conduct disorder, 8% have an anxiety disorder. And now these numbers are actually pre-pandemic. This is from NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and the National Institute of Mental Health, who've put together these stats. They are coming out with new stats post-pandemic, and we're anticipating these numbers to have increased, but they haven't released those numbers yet. There has been a study that was just released, I believe it was a couple of weeks ago, it was completed by Dr. Rana, I believe, Dr. Awad of the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab out in California. And it was in conjunction with the ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, in which it was found that among Muslim youth in the United States, Muslim youth are twice as likely as non-Muslim youth in America to attempt suicide. And this was really startling, this number. But for us, in the counseling realm, we do see this on a consistent basis, the attempts of suicide. And again, it's important to note that the attempts were what were looked at, not necessarily the outcomes. And so the attempts of suicide among Muslim American youth is twice that of non-Muslims. And we're going to talk about why again in a bit and how we can address it. But we do see that in this study, suicide was the 3rd leading cause of death in youth between the ages of 10 to 24 pre-pandemic. Right now, preliminary studies are showing that it's actually the 2nd leading cause of death in youth between ages 10 to 24 post-pandemic. So that is really concerning, of course, and something that we want to better understand. And you can kind of take a look at some of the other statistics here as well that tell us that mental health is important and it needs to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed in our Muslim communities because we are seeing the outcome of ignoring mental health. And, that was just one example, the youth in Texas and the way that they approach their feeling of being unhappy. As educators, we are that first line where we can pick up on cues and we can guide our students and families and parents, hopefully, towards seeking help. So, what I drew here, what we have here is that a lot of times we tend to underplay what our students are going through, and we'll just say, oh, it's just stress. And even for us as adults, a lot of times we'll downplay it and we'll talk about it being stress. I'm just stressed. I feel stressed. But there is a point in which stress turns into something a bit more than stress, a lot more than stress. And, the letters that I have on the bottom here, I'd love if you could kind of venture a guess, everyone who's in the audience who's attending, what do you think BPD stands for, PTSD and OCD? And they're terms that are thrown around a lot when we talk about mental struggles, but not everybody knows what they are. So BPD, PTSD, and OCD. Let me know what you think they might be. And you can either chat or you can verbalize it in the mic, either one. Okay, so we got an answer. Bipolar disorder for BPD, post-trauma stress disorder, and overcompulsive disorder. So very close, Brother Fawad. You almost got them all right. So BPD, most people often think that BPD is referring to bipolar disorder. And if it's listed as BPD1 or BPD2, so BPD with a Roman numeral 1 after, or BPD with a Roman numeral 2 after it, it's referencing bipolar disorder. When it is just written as BPD, it may be referencing borderline personality disorder. And that tends to be more common, borderline personality disorder. We tend to see that more commonly among younger individuals, among students within the middle school and the high school age. We usually identify or diagnose BPD1 or BPD2 after there has been manic depressive disorders or manic depressive episodes, and they might fall into that category. But at the younger stage, we usually see borderline personality disorders. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and even though that's something that, clinically back, when you look at the DSM-5 in the Handbook of Psychology, you'll see that PTSD is often referencing situations that occur when someone has been in the military, when someone recalls instances of abuse. We are definitely seeing an increase in PTSD cases among post-pandemic teens and most post-pandemic youth in terms of dealing with the loss, whether it is loss of family, loss of school, loss of normalcy, and we are seeing indicators of PTSD. And the last one, OCD, is actually obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's interesting because within this past year and a half, we are seeing a rise among Muslim teens in particular in a specific type of OCD behavior, which is known as scrupulosity. And scrupulosity is an OCD behavior that's tied to religious ritual. And because as Muslims, our faith does have a ritualistic component to it, we tend to see that, teens who adhere to the Islamic faith can sometimes develop this scrupulosity in response to a lack of control. So a lot of times OCD behaviors are developed in response to a lack of control. There's also a chemical imbalance to it, a component to it that goes hand in hand with that. But what we'll see, for example, is a child who spends hours in the bathroom making wudu. And when they come out, you see that their hands are rubbed red, right? A child who takes a very long time in prayer because they're repeating one verse over and over again. A child who feels impure and unclean, and so they won't sit on a certain seat, or, they'll refuse to, in cleaning themselves, they won't go to the bathroom in school because they're afraid that they won't be able to cleanse themselves. And there's, of course, different varying degrees of this behavior, this OCD behavior that's known as scrupulosity, but we are seeing a rise in it post-pandemic. And there are some theories that are linked to the fact that we've talked so much about washing hands and germs that because of the fear and the anxiety that's linked to it, you'll see a rise in OCD behaviors. So it's something to look out for. If you have a student who is spending an inordinate amount of time in the bathroom, you don't want to just assume, oh, they might be vaping in the bathroom, or, you want to look into it, of course, but there may also be a mental health disorder that they're struggling with that is linked to scrupulosity. So it's something to be aware of. We also see it in adults, but we tend to see it starting usually within those middle school years, around 7th or 8th grade. And many times it's linked to puberty, that post-puberty, especially children who feel like they don't have control or they don't fully understand, the stages of puberty. We also see scrupulosity sometimes becoming a problem there. So it's something to look out for, something to understand. And again, as teachers and educators, we are not in the position to diagnose. We are not in the position to call up a parent and say, your child has a mental health disorder and we're going to label it scrupulosity. But we are in the position to begin to recognize the signs and to guide our students and our parents to the help that they need, and to equip ourselves in the best way possible to be frontline or first line responders, right? To be able to know how to respond when we first see these elements and these aspects. So, we've been seeing a lot of conversation, or hearing a lot of conversation about anxiety, anxious feelings, right? And there is a difference between having an anxiety attack and having a panic attack. There is a difference between having clinical anxiety, chronic anxiety, and situational anxiety. So situational anxiety, and the same goes for depression. Depression is one of those words that, kids will sometimes throw out there very nonchalantly, like, oh, I'm so depressed, or I just got a bad grade in the test. Oh, I'm so depressed. But really recognizing that depression is a diagnosis, particularly if it's clinical or chronic, but it can also be situational. So situational anxiety or situational depression is linked to a specific situation. So if it is something that is contained within a certain period of time, it still does not mean that we ignore it and we just say, oh, it's just based on the situation, you'll be fine. Oh, it does need to be addressed. And sometimes situational anxiety, situational depression can be combated or tackled with talk therapy. It can also sometimes be combated with CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. And again, these are all, remedies that are sought out through a professional, right? We don't need to become CBT or DBT experts, but you want to know where to guide students towards in order to get that help. When you have clinical or chronic anxiety or depression, anxiety or depression, you will find that it tends to be more prolonged. A lot of times triggers cannot be isolated, so you won't be able to identify specific triggers that may cause it. It'll last for longer periods of time, and it will be repetitive. So you may have a seasonal depression, for example, where every winter you have an extended period of time where you're struggling to get out of bed. When it impacts the functional, it will usually be diagnosed as either clinical or chronic, because then it's getting in the way of the day-to-day. Situational depression and anxiety can also impact the functional, but it is usually for shorter periods of time, and there is ways of being able to overcome it with the help, whether it's through talk therapy or some other form of intervention. Now, panic attacks and anxiety attacks can often look similar, but they tend to have some slight differences. So a child who may have a panic attack may feel like they can't breathe. There's often symptoms of, you'll see redness in the face often, possibly sweating. Anxiety attacks sometimes are more on the internal and may not always show the external manifestations. Although with anxiety attacks, there can be a numbing in the fingers as well. There can be almost what may look like an epileptic seizure, can often be linked to an anxiety attack as well. So know the signs. If you have a child who is showing the beginnings maybe of panic, of anxious feelings, begin to identify them. And again, it's a lot of times it's going to be in the nonverbal. It could be a flitting of the eyes. It could be a nervous fidgeting of the hands. It could be movement in the seat. It could be lack of movement and, a change in the color of the face. So there's a lot of different symptoms that we can kind of identify non-verbally, and then we can begin to sense that somebody may be going through something, and you want to tackle it and identify it as early on as possible, and ensure that the child has the support, whether it's going to the guidance counselor's office or stepping out of the room, making sure that they're taking deep breaths. And we'll talk about some of the other coping mechanisms that can be utilized if you begin to identify anxious feelings, kind of manifesting in the child. Now, also knowing the difference between the terminology. A lot of times, students will just say, I'm sad, I'm depressed, I'm completely despairing, So there is a difference, of course, in each of these categories. And when we look at these categories from an Islamic perspective, we begin to understand that we have examples in the seerah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even, in which we see the differences in the depth of these emotions. And so we see sadness often as being a response, an emotional response to the loss of something or the absence of something. So many of our students probably felt very sad throughout this pandemic, sad that their plans were canceled, sad that they couldn't see friends, sad that, you know, the school year is completely online. Some may have been happy, but, you know, for the most part, we're seeing a lot of sadness. And we see the example of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who experienced sadness when there was an absence of revelation for some time. And it wasn't until the revelation of Surah Al-Duha that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam felt that relief of that sadness, when Allah Azza wa Jal gave the reminder that just as there is night, there is also day. There is a swearing by the night and the day. And there is a reminder that, you know, just as the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was found as an orphan, it was Allah Azza wa Jal that gave him refuge. And there's a great deal of knowledge that we can gain from the surah and that we can guide our students towards in understanding how to cope with sadness. Grief tends to be a form of emotional output that usually is accompanied again with a physical show. So grief is often accompanied by tears. And again, we see a moment of grief in the life of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam upon the burial of his son Ibrahim, when he shed tears. And when he was asked by those around him, you know, why do you shed tears? Isn't this the qadr of Allah? He said, "Al-ayn tadma," right? The eye shows tears or you know, releases tears. وَالْقَلْبِ يَحْزَنُ, and the heart feels sadness, but the tongue does not utter anything that goes against the will of Allah. And so we recognize that grief, again, is a valid emotion. And this is what's so important for our students, to recognize and understand that their emotions are valid. So one of the worst things that we can do to our students is that when they say, "I feel sad," you know, our response is something like, "Why? There's nothing to be sad about." Or, you know, "What are you sad about? You know, everything is great," or "You're having a good day," or "You're playing with your friends." So we want to make sure that we don't invalidate that emotion, that when a child says, "I feel sad," we understand and recognize that, okay, this is a valid emotion. Let's try to understand why. Now, the aspect of sorrow tends to be a bit more elongated. And again, we have the example in the life of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam with Aam al-Huzn, a year of sorrow, in which the passing of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam's beloved wife Khadija radiallahu anha and his beloved uncle caused that heaviness. And sorrow often looks like heaviness. Like when there was a study that was done a while back where children were asked to draw their response to something that would have, you know, brought up sorrow. It would have been categorized as sorrow. And so many of them drew like heavy bags, like someone carrying heavy bags. And it's such a poignant way to capture what sorrow feels like, that it may not feel like piercing arrows, but it feels like a heaviness. Then we go to the next category of depression. And this is the term that I was saying, we hear it so frequently among middle schoolers, among high schoolers, and sometimes elementary schoolers will be using this word as well. But it's not something to be used lightly. Now, depression is also something that we see and understand in the Quran. And one of the most beautiful examples is in the example of Maryam alayhi salam, when she is going through a very difficult time and she is, you know, giving birth to Isa alayhi salam alone. And the verse in the Quran that reminds us of how painful this was when she says, "Ya laytani mitt qabla hadha wa kuntu nasyan mansiya." Oh, if only I had passed before this, and if only I had been of those who were forgotten. And this essentially captures what depression is. So when a child or a student says something like, "Oh, like, I wish I wasn't here anymore," right? We need to address that. And that goes, you know, if you look at the slides, red flag behaviors, that would qualify as a red flag behavior. But we also have to understand that this is a valid feeling, a valid emotion, that there are times where even Maryam alayhi salam, who is one of the chosen women for Jannah, who will enter Jannah, felt the sense of, oh, if only I was not here, if only I had passed before this. And oftentimes depression is captured in those words, in that terminology. And so identify it, recognize if someone says, you know, a while back, I know there was the show on Netflix that had come out called 13 Reasons Why. And if you are an educator, if you are a parent, please familiarize yourself with the show, because as graphic as it is and as difficult as it is to watch sometimes, it also captures really well what a lot of our youth go through that we don't even realize. We may think like, oh, rape culture, that has nothing to do with us as Muslims, you know, the LGBTQ issues, not us. And I would definitely say, yes, us. Yes, our children do go through these things. And yes, they do experience these things, and we need to be aware of them. But in that show, there was a term that was used. It was FML, which is F standing for a bad word and my life, right? And essentially when people felt like, oh, I hate my life, they would say FML. And there was a period of time where we were seeing in a lot of Islamic schools, children as young as middle school writing FML on the top of their papers. And it was a reference to the show, meaning they had watched the show. Many of them, their parents had no idea, but they were impacted by it. And they had this sense of like, oh, I don't want to be here anymore. So it's important, know what it is, understand that depression can impact functionality. Children who are no longer doing their homework, children who are coming to school, maybe looking unkempt, not showered, children who are withdrawing, all of these signs could be signs of depression and they need to be addressed. And then finally, despair. This is where we are reminded in the Quran, لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله. Do not despair of the mercy of Allah, because despair is the highest level. When we look at red flag behaviors, it is the highest level, because when we go back to that letter, for example, that was written by that teen in Texas, we see that despair is the point where you lose all hope, where you just feel there's no reason to keep going, and that it's often tied to active suicide attempts. So no longer just suicide ideation, where you're thinking about suicide, you're thinking of not being here, but active attempts. And a lot of times, we can see self-harm behaviors being indicative of someone who is going through sadness or grief or sorrow. But when we start to see red flag behaviors that climb up on that ladder, essentially, we're often seeing individuals or students who are going through these categories. Maybe they've experienced sadness and then it's escalated to grief, and then they've experienced sorrow because it was extended, and then they've fallen into depression, and then they may be at that stage of despair. So know your students, know what they're experiencing, and understand where they're coming from. And of course, one of the most beautiful verses, I think, in the Quran that helps us and helps our students. Yeah, I think there's a question. Go ahead, Brother Fawad. Yeah.
Dr. Susie,
yeah.
These, when you just talked about knowing the difference, these look like stages. Does you naturally, like, to get to depression or despair, you have to go through the previous ones, or can you land in any of those stages based on the event or the circumstance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And no, you can in and out of those stages. And I guess that's why I wouldn't necessarily use the term stage, but those emotional categories, essentially. And you can be in and out of them. You can feel deep sadness one day, and the next day you might be happy. And the day after that, you may fall into despair. So it's not necessarily, that you're here, then you're here, then you're here. It's that each one does indicate an escalation in terms of our levels of concern and how we would address them. So someone who's experiencing sadness may just need to talk to someone. Maybe just the talking with the guidance counselor is enough. But someone who is experiencing depression, I would definitely escalate that and make sure that a psychologist is called, or that an appointment is made, or the family is notified, right? So it's just how you would respond to them would be different. But we can in and out of those categories at all different ways and different times, and spend different periods of times in each category. Okay. So this is a verse in the Quran that I think is something that, again, regardless of the subject that we're teaching, know that our children are coming to us, our students are coming to us with heaviness, right? We've all been tested throughout this past year and a half, right? And we've been tested in different ways. And so reminding our children that yes, we have been tested and we will be tested, because Allah Azza wa Jal reminds us of the tests that we will experience and encounter. And that will be tested with something of fear. And that's, that fear, that's the anxiety, that's the uncertainty avoidance that we talked about, right? And something of hunger. So many people have, struggled. I know some of the campaigns that we've been doing through Cornerstone since the pandemic began do revolve around food security and making sure that people have enough to eat, because you don't realize until the pandemic hit how many children relied upon, within our own communities even, relied upon, food within the school system, and they weren't able to get that. And tested with a loss of wealth. Again, so many people lost their jobs during this pandemic, a loss of lives. Somebody had mentioned that before, that so many of our students have lost loved ones, and they're struggling to cope with it, and they may not know how. And yet at the end, we're reminded to give good news to the patient, right? وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. And teaching our students, what does it mean to be of الصابرين? Not just to be passive, but to actively think about spheres of control. And again, this is so important for our students to understand, because when you are struggling with loss, when you are struggling with tests that we know come from Allah Azza wa Jal, but it's still, they're heavy tests, knowing that there is a sphere of control, and that sphere of control tends to be related back to your reaction. How do you react to the pain? How do you react to that which you're experiencing? And that reaction may be seeking out a counseling session, right? That reaction may be talking to someone about your pain, but giving that understanding of the active act of sabr, that it's not passive, that it's something that you're going to actively do. So just as we were talking about stages, the stages of grief are something that we hear about quite frequently as well. And when we look at these stages of grief from an Islamic perspective, despite knowing that, and again, these are not linear either, although Western and secular psychology looks at stages of grief sometimes in a linear way, that you start out with denial, then you move to anger, then there's bargaining, then you fall into depression, and then there's acceptance. We know that Islamically, we actually start at the bottom. We start with acceptance, right? Because we know that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Amr al-mu'min gharib," that the state of a believer is strange. If there is something good that befalls the believer, he says, Alhamdulillah. And if there is something that is perceived as difficult or hard that falls the believer, he still says, Alhamdulillah. So we start in that place of acceptance and guiding our students also to understanding that, yes, grief is a natural response, that even the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced grief, that we start though with Alhamdulillah, we start with that acceptance, and we understand that, yes, there are going to be moments of denial, and there's going to be moments of anger, and you may even find yourself bargaining, and you may even slip into depression, but there's still that constant acceptance there. Right, we've talked a little bit about this, the verse from the Quran that I had mentioned. I think we skipped one, okay. And we talked about this verse as well from Surah Al-Zumar, لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله, and Surah Al-Duha. And again, it's such a critical surah, because one of the things that we talk about a lot in counseling sessions is having a gratitude journal, being able to refer back in moments of darkness, in moments of pain, refer back to that which is good. And when we look at the last verse in Surah Al-Duha, we're reminded, وَأَمَّا بِنَعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ. And in remembrance of the blessings of Allah, speak about them. Remind yourself, remind others of what is good in your life. And so an exercise that you may want to engage in with your students, and this can be done at any age level, is maybe starting off the year with a gratitude journal, tying it back to Surah Al-Duha, reminding them of the guidance that Allah Azza wa Jal gives us in the Quran, and having them pull that gratitude journal out when they are having a bad day, when things are looking really down. Pull out that journal. What are you thankful for? What is it that you feel happy about? What is it throughout this pandemic that may have lifted you up, that maybe was a positive? And it can be hard, to find those positives, but they're there. So guide the students, maybe make it a Friday activity where there is this gratitude journal. The other aspect, of course, is service, the reminder in the surah of, giving service, right? So that when you're reminded, for example, of what you've been through. So when the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam is reminded, أَلَمْ يَجِدْكَ يَتِيمًا فَآوَى, and then afterwards he is reminded, فَأَمَّا الْيَتِيمْ فَلَا تَقْهَرْ, that you were found as an orphan and you were given refuge. So when you see an orphan, make sure that you don't turn away from that orphan. Make sure that you don't treat the orphan badly. So giving back, so engaging our students also in acts of service, helping them through their own pain, not by pointing out someone else's pain and demeaning their pain or belittling their pain, because that's invalidation, but pointing out someone else's pain and asking, how can we help this person in pain? Not that that person's pain is less than yours or more than yours, but that this person is in pain. And again, reminding our students of the verse in the Quran where we're reminded that Allah Azza wa Jal will not burden a soul with a burden that's greater than that soul will bear, or that soul can bear. And so knowing that each person is going to have their test, but the tests are going to look different. And those are the tests that we can overcome. And that's, that question that was asking about how do you deal with young people who have experienced loss. I think this is, one good way of helping them through it, bringing them back to that faith perspective, which is what, our Islamic schools try to incorporate in every one of our classes. And having, I know some schools have a guidance counselor on staff, some it's the teachers who wind up taking on the role of guidance counselor, but, carving out time from that math class, from that science class, from that English class, to recognize and understand that the emotions are real and that we've all experienced different emotions in response to different things throughout the pandemic. And in that vein, also recognizing that school is not the only system that is impacting our students. When we look at this kind of image of a theory, this is Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. And the theory basically states that when you look at a child, a lot of times, all you may be seeing is the microsystem. You see their family, you see their school, you see, okay, their religious organization or affiliation, but there's a lot of other systems that impact them as well. So there's the mesosystem and the exosystem and the macrosystem and the chronosystem, and all of these different systems will impact our students. So the school board decisions to make education hybrid, for example, last year, or the school board decision to make the education online, or the government decision to put masks on, all of these are going to impact our children. And even though they're not part of the microsystem, they're still impacting our children. So recognize the impact that the system has on the child, and know that the child is not just, in a bubble, only being impacted by the microsystem. And also help the child know that. So understanding that at home, a child may be struggling, a student may be struggling with debt or fears in terms of the family. There may be language barriers where, the parents are not fully understanding what's happening. A lot of our refugee families, for example, that we work with, struggled quite a bit with re-traumatization, particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, with the lockdowns. There was a great deal of, episodes and incidents of PTSD in which many of our refugee clients were reliving lockdowns that they had at home in pre-flight and reliving that pre-flight trauma. So know that every family reacted and responded to the pandemic differently, and that can impact the way that your students are responding now in the classroom. And there may be, toxicity in the home life. Their family may be having professional difficulty. Their parents may have marital and relationship problems. And I can't tell you, one of our divisions at Cornerstone does focus on marriage and pre-marriage, post-marriage, divorce discernment. And it was definitely very heavily occupied and still is, because of the difficulties that have come out in terms of relationships in the home between husbands and wives throughout the pandemic. Issues of self-worth, of fitting in, crises of faith. It's something that we're also seeing quite a bit of, questions of why would God do this? Why would Allah, if He is the most merciful, why would He take my grandmother? Why would my grandfather have gotten so sick? Why did I lose my father or my mother or an older brother or a cousin? This loss and trauma and the questions why. There's a wonderful book. I believe the author is Dr. Gerald Dirks. I believe, I have to double check that though. The book is called Even Angels Ask. And it talks about how so many times with our youth, our Muslim youth, we isolate them and we tell them, don't ask questions, right? It's haram because it just is, pray because you have to. And this is a really good opportunity, in response to the pandemic, to elevate the critical thinking of our youth and to recognize that, yes, even angels ask. And the book gets its title from the reference to the verses in the Quran when Allah Azza wa Jal says that the angels asked, why are you going to create a human race that will cause corruption on the earth? And the response that the angels get is not one of like, you shouldn't ask, it's not your business. No, Allah Azza wa Jal says that He has an ilm that is different from the ilm that they have. And they may not have that ilm, but it's okay to ask, right? And that's what's important for our children to know too, that it's okay for them to ask, like, why? Why did this happen? Why did Allah Azza wa Jal cause this pain in my life? But it's also important that we help guide them through with the right answers, with answers that allow them to see the rahmah of Allah. Maybe referencing the verses in Surah Al-Kahf of, the reminder of how we don't always know what is it that's happening or why something's happening. But I would definitely say, prepare yourselves, prepare your teachers, prepare the educators in the classroom for these kind of questions, and don't shut those questions down, because they're important questions that our children are asking. Now, another aspect of the system that is outside of school and outside of the jurisdiction of school often is social media, and what our children are being exposed to, and the amount of time that our children have spent on social media during the pandemic. Again, there are a few studies that are in the works right now that have, inshallah, the report should be released soon, but the increase in the amount of time spent on social media during the pandemic, I believe it was between middle schoolers and high schoolers, gaming and social media, it's increased exponentially. And what we're seeing in terms of social media impact, and this could probably be a whole other lecture for a whole other time, but be prepared. Know that children younger and younger are becoming more aware of LGBTQIA+ issues. They are coming in with more questions about gender fluidity, about gender nonconformity. We are seeing differences between social dysphoria and body dysphoria. Issues about pronoun usage and what somebody wants to be called, issues related to sexuality and sexual identity, which if anyone was kind of around during this past June and you got to see the impact of the LGBTQIA+ marketing component, it was, this year there was a lot more marketing of the LGBTQIA+ agenda than we've seen, more so than in any other year. So be aware that you are probably going to get, questions in the classroom. The genderbread person that we see here, this is something that's actually taught in a lot of curricula and in a lot of different public school systems now. The idea that, gender is fluid, gender expression does not need to be linked to biological elements, and sexual orientation is independent also from gender identity. So like I said, we could probably have a whole lecture just on this topic, but just be aware that this may be coming into your classroom. Questions, conversations, things that, kids are discussing amongst themselves. Know how to address it. Recognize and understand that, the push to kind of define sexuality as an identity rather than an action really doesn't coincide with our Islamic perspective. That action is differentiated from identity, that an identity of someone, is as a Muslim American, for example, this is an identity. Why? Because they practice Islam, they believe in the faith, right? But when a child as young as 11 or 12 identifies, for example, as pansexual, and that child has never had a sexual encounter, and pansexual is the idea that you're sexually attracted to anyone of any gender, or any pronoun usage. So it's essentially you're attracted to the spirit of something or someone rather than the person. If they're identifying as pansexual at age 11 or 12 and they've never had a sexual encounter, this shouldn't be an identity because there's an action that is involved with sexuality. And so we as educators, we definitely need to educate ourselves a bit more on what we're seeing out there. So there are a lot of youngsters who identify as omni or pansexual or even demisexual, which is, again, in terms of terminology, sometimes we hear the word demisexual and we're like, oh, but the reality is it simply means not being sexually interactive or wanting to have a sexual relationship unless there is a deep emotional bond. So technically demisexual is, it's pretty halal, right? Because unless you have a deep emotional bond through the act of marriage, maybe, but it's more about utilizing the label and identifying yourself based on a sexuality rather than recognizing that the sexuality is linked to an act rather than an identity. So be aware, know that we are seeing, again, and I'm simply kind of presenting what we've been seeing arise in, particularly over the past year and a half. And we've definitely been seeing an increase in terms of youth, Muslim youth in the Muslim community, bringing up these topics and struggling with identity within, gender fluidity, gender nonconformity, and LGBTQIA+ perspectives. Oops. All right, so what are we going to do? How are we going to in the next 15 minutes or so, and I'll make sure that we leave about 15-20 minutes for questions. What are we going to do as teachers based on everything that we've seen so far and what we anticipate? So bringing resilience into the classroom. First of all, we want to create a sense of security because we know that for our children, remember that high uncertainty avoidance that we talked about, it can really shake foundations of security and it can cause children to feel unanchored. And so we want to create that sense of security. We want to ensure that there is empathy in our responses rather than just always taking an action-oriented approach. So a child says, I'm sad. Our first response may not be go to the guidance counselor or, there's no place for sadness in this classroom, right? We want to have that empathy, validate, identify, and repeat, oftentimes by mirroring what the child says. So if the child says, I'm sad, right? Match your tone to the way that the child has said it. Make sure that your eye contact is mirroring what you're seeing. And you might want to respond by saying, what is that makes you sad? Utilize similar tone, similar, inflection, similar volume, and that will help the child in feeling validated rather than dismissed. Ensuring that there are parental partnerships. Please hold sessions in your school, involve the parents, let them understand the importance of mental wellness, let them understand the impact of social media and what our children are facing, because 20 years ago, none of us were really dealing with an LGBTQIA+ and rainbow flags. What our kids are seeing today and what they're identifying through Instagram, through Snapchat, through all of those social media avenues, through TikTok, through YouTube is very different than what we've encountered. And educating our parents is the best way to make those partnerships. And using differentiated, and I know many of you have, a lot of experience with differentiated learning and differentiated classrooms, but using differentials, even when you're dealing with the emotional output that children are putting out. Some children are going to naturally exhibit more of an emotionally resilient demeanor, and some children are not. Know the differences in how your children respond, how your students respond to the world around them. And adjust, because it's not a one size fits all. It's not, the one verse that works for everyone, right? But just hear the children out, listen to your students, and that will make a difference. Getting to know your students, maybe starting off every, classroom, every session by asking questions. And I know some of these questions may seem silly, but they tend to get students talking a bit more about what they're feeling. So if you were a cartoon character, who would you be? Let's say a child says, oh, well, I'd be SpongeBob, follow up with a why, and I'm not talking about elementary school students only. I'm talking about the middle schoolers and the high schoolers who may be struggling with their emotion, who are used to coming into Algebra 1 or, Spanish class or French class and, tackling questions that deal with tests and academic, show them that you care about who they are. What's one food you'd never want to taste again and why, right? If you had a time machine, where would you travel to? So questions that help the student feel like you care about them, that you're getting to know them. And doing this early on in the year, in those first few days, that opens up the avenues of empathy. Of course, VARC, I know as educators, you're all probably very familiar with this, the different comprehension styles, but VARC also applies to emotional intelligence and increasing the emotional quotient within the classroom. And some kids will be able to express themselves emotionally through a visual. So asking students, draw what you feel right now. Take out a pen, pull out a piece of paper. I want you to draw what you feel. And some people, and I've seen this in classrooms where some students will just scribble all over the paper. And that scribbling means something. There could be tension, there could be anger, there could be negative emotions. Some students may draw a flower or a sunshine, and maybe that's a positive, but find different ways to help children comprehend their own emotions. And again, when I say children, I'm talking about all age levels, because we need to increase emotional intelligence and the emotional quotient at every age level. And then the nonverbals. I apologize, guys. I thought I was coming to the end, but I think I have a few more slides, so I'll go for a little bit longer before we do the Q&A. The nonverbals, right? So a lot of times the nonverbals are more telling than the verbals. And we know it in the classroom. If we are consistently teaching with our backs turned to the class, writing on the board, we are missing a great deal of the interaction that we should be having with our students. So we want to ensure that we are looking for certain changes in facial expressions, maybe the tone of voice, a child who is normally maybe, kind of complacent in the way they speak. If you're seeing spikes and hearing spikes in how they speak, that may be an indicator that something is a little bit off. looking at the movement, the eye contact, the overall appearance, but really listening to the nonverbals and recognizing that nonverbals can tell a story that is sometimes much louder than the verbals. And this is just an example. If you were to look at box number, let's pick a box number 5, what emotion do you think this teenager is feeling in box number 5? You could put it in the chat box or you can speak with your mic. What emotion do you think is being exhibited in box number 5? Fear, okay. Disgust, okay. Anyone else have an emotion? No? Okay, so we got fear and disgust. So I'll tell you a little bit about this image here. Worried, okay. So we've got the same image, right? And we have anger, lost. Okay, this is great. So we've got the same image and we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 responses, and all 5 responses are different. And this tells us something about our own ability to read nonverbal cues. Confused, now we got 6 responses and they're still all different. Right? So when we look at nonverbals, particularly with teenagers, because teenagers tend to have this kind of disgruntled expression on their face quite frequently, right? A lot of times we'll simply lump or categorize emotions as like negative or positive, right? And it's interesting that in number 5, most of you chose emotions or expressions that would classify as negative, right? And you identified this as number 5 being a negative emotion. But when you look at the breakdown here, so this young woman was being told that these images were taken within, I believe it was 33 seconds. And it was just a camera that was taking, very quick pictures of the expressions that were changing. And this child was being told a story, essentially. They were, some kind of narration. It was like a case study that was being done. And as the story was being told, you see that the expressions are changing. But within 33 seconds, if you were simply talking, you probably would have missed all of these individual expressions. You probably would have only noted expression number 9, which in the end, whoever said confused to number 5, that was actually number 9. In the end, the young woman was just confused. Like, what did I just do here? What did I just hear? What was I listening to? At point number 5, though, it was an indicator. And what happened was the story was broken down after she was given the kind of the narrative, and she was asked to rate how she felt with each sentence that was said. And then the ratings to each sentence was correlated to the facial expression. So when she got to number 5 and that statement number 5, she actually said that she was feeling very neutral, that at point number 5, she simply felt like she was listening and she was giving the person a chance to kind of explain themselves. That at number 1, she was kind of like, okay, I don't know why I'm doing this. At number 2, she was like, are you serious? Like, what's going on here, right? By number 3, she's like, okay, I'm going to try to understand. By number 4, she was starting to lose a little bit of that thread of understanding. By number 5, she reached a neutral plateau. So this is actually a neutral face at number 5, neither positive nor negative, right? The negative emotion started to creep in at point number 6. And so the reason why I share this is because, again, we tend to read what we think we see, right? When we look at the whole scope of all 9 images together, I agree. You could think confused, lost, worried, disgusted, angry. But when you look at each moment in how someone is responding non-verbally, you begin to identify the nuances. And I know when we're in a classroom with, 25, 30 kids, a lot of times we don't have the ability to have that one-on-one. But that's why it's so important, particularly post-pandemic, to be able to carve out time where maybe you're meeting with your students, you've got a group activity and you're calling up students to your desk, one-on-one, just to talk for a couple of minutes, right? Just to say, so how was your summer? How did things go for you? And really pay attention to the nonverbals. Look at how they're responding, not so much the words, because the words might just be fine. Okay, it was good, but look at the nonverbals and how people are responding with the nonverbals. So also recognize that there is spare brain time. So as we're teaching in the classroom, as we're talking, right, our students can comprehend approximately 500 words per minute. But the human rate of speech tends to be between 125 and 150 words per minute. So what happens in that spare brain time, right? If they're only utilizing, they're the part of their brain that's processing 150 words per minute, they've got a whole bunch of words, right? 350 to 400 words in which the brain has spare time. And in that spare brain time, that's when you can most likely read some of the emotions, some of the nonverbals, because they're processing emotions, and how they're responding to what you're saying is most likely going to be a nonverbal output, not in verbal output. All right, so I'm going to quickly just go through some of these other elements, recognizing that you as the teacher, you're also going to feel the strain, right? So you're going to see differences in children's behavior. You're going to see maybe a lack of parental involvement that can be difficult, or parental expectations that are through the roof. You may feel sometimes like, I'm not a therapist, I'm a teacher. Why am I expected to be a therapist? And it's so important for you as teachers and educators as well to take care of you. We've all heard the example before of if you're on a flight and the stewardess says that when the air masks, the oxygen masks drop, make sure that you put the mask on yourself first before you put it on anyone else. And that is so true. So make sure you're taking care of you. And taking care of you means making sure that you're grounding yourself as well as your students, grounding yourself emotionally, mentally, and spiritually with different mindfulness methods. Now, from an Islamic perspective, we know that al-muraqaba and al-hudur are both aspects of our deen. And essentially, they're reminders of being mindful, being present and being mindful. And in the Quran, we are reminded that it is through the remembrance of Allah that hearts find peace. And so making sure that we take time for ourselves to find that peace, to breathe, to remind ourselves of what our purpose is, and that Allah Azza wa Jal has placed us in this position with these students as an amana, right? Because we are meant to take care of them, and they are the ones that we can care for them. Allah Azza wa Jal has given us this responsibility. I love what Dr. Azra said, which was imagine students' expressions with their mask on. So what do they say about eyes, right? They're windows to the soul. So alhamdulillah, the eyes will still be evident, right? So there's a lot that we'll be able to tell from the eyes as well. And just as a general side note, usually when there are positive expressions, you will see a lifting of the facial muscles. If the mask is on and you can't see the lower face, positive expressions often look like a lifting of the upper corners of the eye. So just imagine a smile where everything lifts up, right? And negative expressions tend to be a bit of a downward drop in terms of the eyes. So look to the eyes, look to what's happening around the eyes. That can often clue you into expressions as well. All right, so making sure that as teachers as well throughout the day, you've got those stretching breaks, those breathing breaks, teaching your students to take H breaths, which are the deep breath, deep inhalation through the nose. And then if you were to put your hands in front of your mouth and you go, you're making a bit of an H sound from the back of your throat. And this helps with the expansion of the diaphragm and the relaxation of the muscles. So taking those breaks, and again, you've got a 45-minute period and you may be thinking, I have so much to teach them. We've lost an entire year of learning. But think about the emotional wellness, think about the mental wellness. And if we can ensure that we're all in a good space there, then everything else will follow, insha'Allah. And finally, one of the notes that I think is incredibly helpful is utilizing mindfulness techniques like the 5-4-3-2-1 method. And this is a technique you can use. It's something you can teach your students. And interestingly enough, it's very much tied to that muraqaba and that hudur that we talked about. So when you start to identify signs of anxious feelings, being able to first stop, ask the student or ask yourself even to pause and identify 5 things you can see. So let's say you have a verse from the Quran hanging up on your wall, for example. Maybe it is لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها, right? Maybe it is a verse that, لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله. Put a verse up on the wall. Remember, we want to keep in our Islamic schools that connection to faith and that important role that faith plays in bringing us holistic wellness. So identify 5 things you can see. And maybe on the first day of class, tell your students, I want you to look around the room and I want you to identify 5 things that bring you comfort. And make sure you've got some comfortable things around the room. Maybe there's a picture of an ocean. Maybe there's a sunrise. Maybe there are a few verses from the Quran, but 5 things they can see. Then it's going to be 4 things that you can touch. And interestingly enough, when we do tasbih and we push on the aqlas of our finger, it's actually just recently been found that these actually parts of our fingertips are connected to certain areas of our body that work almost like acupuncture. So as you're putting pressure on the fingers, and this is the beauty of our deen, right? And subhanallah, alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, you are actually activating within yourself a natural type of hudur and a natural mindfulness that will calm the nerves and the muscles down. So 4 things you can touch, maybe starting with tasbih and using pressure points. So maybe pushing against your fingers and feeling it and saying, I feel my fingers pushing against one another. Sujood is also a grounding technique. Even for non-Muslims, when the forehead touches the ground, there is an activation in the body that brings a person back to that grounding feeling of presence. I am here. And that's essentially what grounding techniques are. They interrupt the negative thought train and they allow you to come back to the present. So 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can smell, maybe having in your classroom oud or misk or something that is a pleasant smell that students know they can inhale if they're feeling tense or anxious. 2 things you can hear. So now you sit in silence and you really just listen. And again, maybe you've got some, calming nasheed or a verse from the Quran that you could hit play on the computer if you feel like tensions are high and students are nervous and there's a big exam that's coming, utilizing that hearing. And then 1 thing you can taste. And I often tell my clients, keep like those warhead candies or those Sour Patch, something that's really going to instigate that sense of taste. And again, we know, for a child, a baby who's feeling upset, a lot of times we'll put the pacifier in the mouth because the mouth is a source of comfort. And if we're able to, activate that source, it can bring us to that place of comfort. So it's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It utilizes the 5 senses. It interrupts the negative thought train and brings you back to the present. I see a question about the PowerPoint. Yes, I can definitely share that, Dr. Azra. It's not a problem. All right, and this is the final slide, I promise. But this was a study that was done by ISPU, the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, and it showed that Muslims are among the most likely to say that faith is a source of happiness. And I think it's so important that we don't forget that. So we see white evangelicals, we're at 94%, and Muslims were at 85%, saying that faith is a source of happiness. So many of our students come to a place where they feel like faith is difficult, that Islam is heavy, that it's the source of their problems. But in reality, if we guide our students towards an understanding that their faith can be the anchor that gets them through difficult times, then insha'Allah, we're going to see this statistic flying through the roof, because truly our deen is a source of happiness. And I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal allows it to be a source of happiness for us all and for all of our students. There are a couple of resources here, and since I will share these slides with whoever asks for it, I can give it to Sister Layla, and she's welcome to share it with whoever needs it. And inshallah, you are welcome to contact us at Cornerstone if you have any questions or concerns, or you can reach out to me directly. Sister Layla's got my email address as well, and she's welcome to share that with anyone who wants. Jazakumullahu khair. I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal blesses this year and allows us to be truly a blessing for our students, allows our students to be a blessing for us, and helps guide us through the difficulties we may encounter.
Ameen, Allahumma ameen. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Susie. MashaAllah, such a wealth of information, awareness, understanding what our students are coming in with, but also very practical responses to what we may see in the classroom. I want to open it up we have about 10 minutes. If you'd like to ask questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or if you'd prefer to type something in the chat, please do so. I know sometimes when we hear a lot of information, it takes some time to reflect on it, and then the questions come later. And again, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Susie. I think we're going to need a lot of guidance when it comes to our students' mental health and our own. We will, inshallah, Dr. Susie will share the slides with me, and we will send them out to you, inshallah. Are there any questions? Okay. Well, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Susie. May Allah reward you and help us all. May Allah make this an easy year. Inshallah, it will be much better and much more grounded than last year. I think we've learned a lot from the past year and a half or so. And making dua is really important. Making dua and teaching our students that that's one way to deal with things, is to turn to Allah, like Dr. Susie said. So again, Jazakumullah khair. We will close out, and thank you so much for joining us today. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
السلام ورحمة الله. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.